Welcome to Flipping Tables, where we bring all of our religious thinking to Jesus, who flips the table for his upside-down kingdom. I'm Julie Sexton, and I'll be your host. Hey friends, you're listening to episode 37. If you're a new listener, first, welcome to our table. We're so happy you found us, and we hope that you decide to join us each week. And just so you know, a new episode is released every Tuesday, and you can subscribe to Flipping Tables and you won't miss any of our episodes. And also, if you're new and wondering what's this Flipping Tables all about, I want to encourage you to go back and listen to our trailer episode. I think that released way back in February. I'm going to link it in the show notes. And just in short, I'll say that even though Jesus only literally flipped tables once or twice, depending on who you ask, almost every time Jesus spoke, he was overturning tables of thought and human traditions. You've probably heard someone call Jesus, his ministry, an upside-down kingdom. Well, if you're turning a kingdom upside down, then there's going to be some tables that get flipped in the process. But I recently heard someone say, and I love this, she said Jesus was actually flipping things right side up. And I sure hope and pray that he continues to flip things right side up within me. And if that sounds like something that you want Jesus to do inside of you, then friends, pull up a chair, because we've got a place for you at our table. We've been gathering around our table discussing Mark's gospel. And in this episode, which is actually going to be the first of 2 episodes, we're going to be reading and having discussions around Mark's account of the Lord's Supper. I'm Julie Sexton, the host of this podcast, and I'm joined each week by 1 or 2 co-hosts, and this week I'm joined by Twila Brown. Welcome, Twila.
So good to be with you, Julie. I'm happy to be here.
It's always a bright spot when you're here and we're together. And Sir's taking a nap, so that's good. For those of you who don't know, we also have a fur baby co-host who is usually in the room when we're recording because he's emotionally attached to me. I'm his service human.
You're his emotional support human.
I am his emotional support human. That's how
I love it.
It's
really a great descriptor for you and Sir. Yeah.
Yeah. He really loves greeting everybody who comes in. He greets you very enthusiastically, right?
Oh, yes. You're not sure if this is a good excitement or bad. Like at first, it's just so passionate and
because he's like quivering with excitement.
Yes, very, yeah.
Kind of like we are about this lesson that we're going to talk about today.
I'm excited.
We are excited. But, since we're talking about a meal and we love a good meal.
We love it.
So do you have any fun stories or a story about like a tradition or a meal, something memorable?
So this is going to sound bad. I don't mean this as any kind of slight. We didn't sit down and eat a lot of meals in my childhood growing up. We were much more casual and flexible about meals and who ate and when they ate and if we ate together. So it is really a priority to me and in my house that we all sit down and connect. And even if it is Finn, shoveling food into his mouth as fast as he can so he can run out the door and go play with his friends again, I am thankful for, even just 10 or 15 collective minutes. One thing that is a tradition with our meals, and actually this came full circle recently, is we like to do, like what was the best part of your day? Or when Avery and Jalen, when it was just them, they were the only kids around before a Finn or a Theo ever existed. We would do, because, I was like the stepmom, bonus mom, trying to like connect with these kids that are like middle schoolish, high schoolish, boys, they're hard to talk to. And so I would always say, what was your high and what was your low? Just as a way to kind of get them talking and to learn about their day and engage them. And the cutest thing recently, Jalen was going to have a date or an informal hangout with a young lady, and he's very introverted. And apparently this girl is also introverted.
Oh, no.
And yeah, I know, right? I was like, what are you going to do? What are you going to talk about? Are you just going to sit next to each other?
In silence? Oh, no.
So anyway, he must have been putting some thought into it.
That's good.
And he said, well, I was thinking maybe I'll ask her, because it was going to be after she got off work that day. I was thinking maybe I would ask her what was her high and her low.
Aww.
And I was like, oh. And so the next day when I texted him, I was like, so, how did it go the other day? He said, we actually talked the whole time. And he said something to the effect of, and like, thanks for the bonus mom win with the high low or something like that. It was so cute. I was like, oh my gosh. So it was sweet because I'm like, obviously that meant something to him because here he is in his 20s and he is recalling that and like, going to it. So it was really precious. But so long story short, that's our family tradition is talking about our day. And, with them, I'd say high, low. Now we just say, what was the best part of your day? To try to make that connection. What about you?
That's so good that he was doing all of that he thought about that.
It was precious.
And, I don't know if you know this, but I do because Jalen was in the same youth group with my daughters. And their youth minister at the time, when they would go on like the CIY trips, they would, at the end of each day, you gathered together and you would talk about what your high and your low was for the day.
Aww.
So even Nathan Zimmerman was reinforcing that.
I love it. Yeah.
It was always a really good way to end the day. And so something that you were doing with them in your home was being reinforced someplace else.
Yeah.
I think that's really awesome.
It didn't go well with this young lady.
I'm sorry
It's
to hear
not that
that.
it was bad, but it was just like, it's not really there. Anyway, so still very handsome, very single, and very sweet. In case any of our listeners are interested, hit me up.
I do love some Jalen Brown. He is such a sweet boy.
He is sweet and he is
big,
handsome.
Tall guy. But
oh my gosh,
he's like a teddy bear.
Yeah,
exactly.
Exactly.
That's exactly what I picture when I think of him too. When I think about traditions, when you were talking about your growing up formative years, not eating around a table much, that was actually something that my parents did really, really well. And I wish that I had been better with it, particularly around breakfast, because in our house, like my mom and my dad and I would sit down and have breakfast together, even if it was just cereal, kind of like Kimberly has talked about, I think on a previous episode. But it was nice. My dad was going to work. I was going to school. And then in the evening, we would come back together and have a meal. And I didn't do breakfast well with my kids. I did it on the weekend, but not like during the week.
Yeah, we don't either. It's just too many. I mean, none of us are home at the same time for
Everybody
one thing.
leaves at weird times and things. So that was...
but that's sweet. I love that.
Yeah, it was good. And, a lot of people... Because I grew up so differently with, in regards to holidays, Thanksgiving was always a really big deal for us. And I will say that after I got married, it wasn't anything against my in-laws or their family traditions or anything, but it never really felt like Thanksgiving unless I was with my parents.
Right.
And so sometimes when the years that we were with them, I would feel sad at Thanksgiving. So it was like eating my favorite meal of the year, but there was this tinge of sadness.
I'm missing something.
And I think there's like a tinge of sadness and things going on in this meal that we're talking about in the episode today. So since we're going to be talking about celebrating Jesus celebrating the Passover with his disciples, I wanted to dig into Passover. And I really loved reading about the beautiful layers of tradition that go into the way the Jews celebrate this memorial meal. And so I thought Twila and I would maybe talk about some of that and help you, our listeners, to kind of just see the full beauty of what was unfolding. The Jews tell stories, and it's the teaching style. That's kind of lost on us in the West because we don't really do things in a story narrative kind of way.
Right. No, I agree with that. It's funny that you say that because, we just recently on the calendar was Rosh Hashanah, right?
You're right.
And I was thinking, I was trying to like explain it, to Finn. I was like, oh, this is, a Jewish holiday. And I was like, man, we should really do some of these meals because there is such beautiful storytelling to it. And so that's something I love that we're doing this today because I've recently been thinking like I would like to start celebrating some of these different meals and holidays because it does have such richness and storytelling.
We're going to provide probably some Bible passages and maybe some articles or links that we think will be helpful to you, our listeners. So look for those in the show notes. But if you're new around here, you may not know me very well, but so I grew up in a church that celebrated Passover instead of Easter. We also observed the Days of Unleavened Bread. So for a week, every spring, we ate matzahs and rolls and pancakes that were made out of cottage cheese. Did you know you could do that, Twila? And
this does not sound good.
Surprisingly, they're actually pretty tasty.
Oh, okay.
Just so you know. But to this day, for one example, is every time I eat wheat thins, I remember that they are leaven free. Isn't that funny? But like, I'm sure there's so many other crackers and things that don't have leaven in them, but it's wheat thins specifically because I would be like, okay, this is on the approved list of things that I could eat during the Feast of Unleavened Bread.
This is so interesting to me. So did your family do all the things like doing the sweeping the house of all the leavens and going around?
100%. It was
so
deep
intriguing
spring clean.
Okay, tell me about it.
So it was the time of the year that the toaster got cleaned of all of its crumbs.
Wow.
All the yeast, the baking powder, bread, cakes, cookies, bread mixes, everything that contained leavening agents were thrown out. There would be no sandwiches in my school lunch that week.
You didn't go sell like all of the Duncan Hines mixes to like your neighbor and then buy them back?
No,
like allegedly maybe the Jews did.
No, but I remember like people who were in this same tradition, they would be like, is it wrong if I box all of that stuff up and take it to like my aunt's house?
And then go get it back
Then go get it back because I'm going to have to buy all that stuff again. My family didn't do that because I think we were more of the Pharisee sect.
Okay.
A little more strict.
Right.
That was a line we were not going to cross. So it was a hard no on that.
Oh my gosh.
But imagine, I'm like Gen X. I mean, we're Gen X. And so not eating bread hadn't caught on yet.
Right. No, we were still very much in the...
We were carb people.
The carb ages.
The carb ages. I like that. That's good. So to say that I was a little bit weird, stood out a little bit different, because I was growing up in Eastern Kentucky. I was in a small elementary school, and everybody could tell what I was doing.
Right.
It was strange.
That's funny.
And I will say, on a funny note, since you brought up like the deep clean, no matter how hard we tried, we almost always found some pantry item that we had forgotten. It could be that you had forgotten to clean out the baby's car seat, and I remember that specifically because of my brother, who was like 10 years younger than me.
Is there leaven in Cheerios?
I don't know.
Because there's always a rogue Cheerio when you've got a baby, right?
Yeah. Or like if a kid eats a Happy Meal, have you ever found like a piece of a hamburger bun, like
always.
Stuffed down in the cushions?
Yeah, always.
Yeah. Or under the seat that they threw in the floor. Yeah. So there was always stuff like that. Or you might find my mom, because of where we lived, she shopped in Lexington where we live now. And so she would maybe buy like extra bread or something from this bakery that she went to. And so, we might find frozen bread because we forgot to clean out the freezer. I mean, we keep waffles and all kinds of stuff in there.
This is intense.
It was intense. So we're going to talk about the way that the Jews celebrate Passover, and their children were very much a part of it. Now, in my faith tradition, on Passover, children or non-baptized members of that church, they weren't allowed to go. This was not something that was done in the home like the Jewish community would do. It was they went to a church and had this more like a service. And this was the only time of the year that they took communion. And there was also a foot washing ceremony as part of that service. Because, that's what Jesus did with the disciples in John 13. But, it was... I remember they had these little basins and they would have their towel, and I would see all this stuff, and there was all this curiosity within me about what they were doing, but I knew that it was like sacred, because again, when you grow up in religion, there's a lot of condemnation. I've talked about that before. And so for them, this was like the only time of the year that they actually felt like they were sin-free for just a few minutes.
Wow.
Isn't that heavy?
It's so disappointing.
Well, no, it is.
Yeah.
It's a really hard way. And for our listeners who have had a religious background, it may not be the same as mine, but you might be familiar with the weight of condemnation. And so even though I was never a part of one of those Passover services that during those intense years, because again, I was a child and I was not baptized, but I wanted to say that in the transitional period of me becoming an adult and married, this church went through these dramatic changes, and they really transitioned from like being under the law to being under grace. And in that period of time is when Paul and I actually put our faith in Jesus and were baptized. And we were in like a new version.
Yeah.
But we weren't completely separate. Because it's hard. It's hard to separate from your church community, the people that you have, and it had changed so much that it seemed so good. So it was hard. So we did go one time to one of these services, but it was more like done as just kind of like if you and I were to celebrate the Passover now.
Like more commemorative or
Yes.
something than like requirement.
Right. It was much more like that because we knew that we were saved by grace through faith. But it was really, really challenging to do that. So I understand a little bit of what maybe the disciples might have been feeling at the meal that we're going to talk about.
Yeah.
And transitions are hard all the time, right?
Sure.
Any kind of transition. And I actually was just recently listening to another podcast, and one of the guests on that podcast was talking about how difficult it is to transition to a new church. Because in this case, they were talking about like leaving because there was some type of moral failure or there was some toxic Christianity and needing to separate, and how difficult even that is. Because when you go to a new church, it may take you a year or something before you really start to feel comfortable and be healed from whatever you've gone through. And I think that's how when Paul and I finally left and kind of broke off, it was really hard.
Yeah.
And it took us about a year before because I said, well, exactly what that man just said on that podcast is true. It really took us about a year before we felt like we were comfortable enough to begin serving in that church and to begin making friends.
Yeah. That's interesting.
It was challenging. With all that being said, when I read about Jesus celebrating the Passover and transitioning his disciples to the Lord's Supper, it raises some questions in me. And I, again, am empathetic towards the disciples because I understand how hard it is to change something as foundational as the Passover was to them. There was a part of something that was ending and something that was just beginning. So Passover commemorates the Israelites leaving Egypt, and God delivered them from slavery. And you can read about it in Exodus 12. They were getting a fresh start. And one of the things that Exodus 12 starts with is God told Moses, hey guys, I'm giving you a new calendar. This is going to be the first month of the first year of you beginning your new life. I love how God did that. That's amazing because I love a fresh start in a fresh year.
Totally.
And they were coming out of slavery, and God's like, it's basically your January 1st, but it was, different name, different time. It was spring, and he told them that on the 10th day, they were to select a 1-year-old lamb without defect for each household. And then on the 14th day, they would sacrifice the lamb. They would roast it, and they would serve it with bitter herbs and this bread without yeast. And the Passover kicked off this 7-day feast of the Days of Unleavened Bread. And the first day of that is always treated like a Sabbath, which is kind of important for us to remember that they treated the first day of unleavened bread as they would a regular Shabbat. like a 24-hour period of rest from
Right.
sundown to sundown, which is another part of the story because we do days much differently, right?
Right. I think that's an important note, and is always even confusing for us. We were even having this conversation before we started recording, but yeah, it's the sundown starts the new day.
Starts the new day. So their new day starts in the evening.
Right. Which is just backwards for the way that we are accustomed to doing things here. But yeah, so when we were in Israel, we went to the market on a Friday and saw all the people during the daytime getting all of their things and preparing to begin their Shabbat. And then at sundown, we actually had a dinner in our hotel and got to witness a lot of families' Shabbat dinners that they were having, and how interesting that is. And so then that went until sundown or evening on Saturday.
And that was one of your favorite days.
It was. I loved it. I thought it was just beautiful. Like, I loved all of just the richness of it.
I know. Yeah. And it brought up so many memories for me because I had grown up in the Sabbath keeping tradition.
Frame of reference. I was like, this is cool.
Where at sundown, we stopped, we didn't watch TV. We didn't do, it was just about rest and family. And it was totally different.
Yeah.
So when I was there, I was like, oh, I'm familiar with this. I remember what this is like. But I do, and I see the beauty in it.
Yeah.
Sabbath is about restoration. It is a gift to us. And this was a celebration. Yeah. God kicked off his people being delivered from slavery with essentially a celebration and a party and a period of rest. And because they're a narrative telling culture, they got to relive this amazing separation. It's kind of like when we tell our testimony.
Yeah, their deliverance.
It's about deliverance.
Yeah.
Being delivered from slavery. And when we tell our testimony, we're telling about when we were delivered from sin and death. It's amazing. And so let's talk about some of the components to the meal and make some comparisons, because I think all these details, they just add to the richness of the Lord's Supper and seeing Jesus as the Passover lamb. So in a part of this meal, there would be these bitter herbs, which is usually like horseradish, that represents the bitterness of slavery. They would dip those herbs in salt water, which was to remind them of tears that were shed under oppression. Because remember, they were crying out to God for help and for deliverance. So the little lamb would live in their homes for 4 days with them. And then when that little lamb would be sacrificed, it was to remind them of this sin-bearing sacrifice. When they would, hundreds and hundreds of years later, have a temple, the lambs would be sacrificed. All the lambs would be sacrificed in the temple. So everybody would travel then to Jerusalem. But, this was their very first Passover. They were leaving Egypt. That's the night. They were going to eat this meal, and then they were going to leave. And there's the Passover. The blood of the lamb was put on the doorpost. So when we think about it being put at the top and the sides, with our eyes looking back, we can see the cross.
Yeah. God
was already teaching them a story that was still future.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
It's wild.
Every bit of the details of what was being implemented in Exodus was going to be fulfilled and carried out in Christ. So amazing. So they would be eating unleavened bread. So why were they having unleavened bread, Twila?
So that was representative of the sin and how we're trying to clean all of that out. And so that's, representative of them cleaning all of the leaven out of their homes and trying to clean all the sin out of our lives.
And that really kind of built in more later. But that first night that they were eating this unleavened bread was because they were leaving Egypt in haste. The death angel that was the last plague. Remember the last plague? That's why they had the blood on their door, on their doorway, so that the death angel would pass over them, and would not strike their firstborns down when the Egyptians. So they were doing this in faith. It was it was an act of faith, and they kind of were like eating like it says in Exodus 12 that they were like to have their staff in their hand and their robe tucked in, because they were literally going to eat this fast meal and they were going to leave Egypt that night.
Yeah.
It's beautiful and wonderful because the Israelites were being delivered from sin and death, but it is set against this backdrop of the Egyptians
Right.
wailing.
Right.
And so again, there's like this tension of this heaviness that's going to be on it. And I think that the tension is in the room with Jesus and the disciples when we get into talking about the Lord's Supper. So now let's transition to thinking about in Jesus's day, in the first century, they had already began to transition to celebrating the Passover seder. It's going to be a little different than if you have any knowledge of how like a Messianic Jew celebrates a Passover seder today, as believing in Jesus as the Passover lamb. But what they were doing was the transition that was happening in Jesus's time was, instead of celebrating the Passover on that evening of the 14th day, which, again, that's confusing to us because we're thinking about that as night. So they would have a shorter condensed meal without lamb. And sometimes in Israel now, they refer to that as more like the clean out the pantry kind of meal.
Yeah.
So they were just eating up all the leavened bread and things. Because we don't know for sure that Jesus and the disciples were having unleavened bread at the Lord's Supper, because the word that is used could go either leavened or unleavened. We know that they probably were not eating lamb at their meal.
Right.
So think about, they're doing this kind of clean out the pantry meal, and then the next, I'm trying to say next day, but it's their day. They are would be that evening having the Passover seder.
Right.
So there's a lot to kind of unpack there. But so in a Passover seder, they would have like 4 cups of wine that would go during that meal. And I think it's so interesting what each one of these cups represent. And they're, again, telling the narrative. They're going back to Exodus 6 and 7. The first cup that the head of the household, the head of the table, would lift up this cup, and he would call it's the cup of sanctification. And he would say, I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians, from Exodus 6:6. And then they would come to the second cup, which is the cup of judgment. And they would make this I will statement. I will rescue you from their bondage. And they would then talk about the 10 plagues. They would recite these plagues. And as each one was recited, they would drop. A drop of wine was spilled on the table to represent each one of the plagues. And they would eat the matzah. And why were they eating unleavened bread? They were doing it because they left Egypt in haste. And then the third cup, the cup of redemption, I will redeem you with an outstretched arm. Now, at this point, some of the commentators that I read said that when Jesus was doing this kind of clean out the pantry preparation day Passover meal with his disciples, when he got to this cup, this is probably where he instituted the new covenant, because it's the cup of redemption. And when it says that he says to them, I'm not going to drink again of the fruit of the vine until we drink it together in the kingdom. The fourth cup, he didn't pour and say, because what they would do in a regular seder, it's the cup of praise, and before that they would recite and sing many psalms, and then they would lift up that fourth cup, and the household leader would say, I will take you as my people, from Exodus 6:7. And then the whole Seder would conclude with all those around the table reclining, saying, next year in Jerusalem. And that is all so incredibly beautiful to kind of layer all of these different ways that this meal was going. So I hope this really sets us up to talk about the type of meal that Jesus had with his disciples. And I think it's something interesting that the youngest child in the family was the one who would ask questions to lead the father to retell the story. Isn't that beautiful?
I love it. I would love to be a fly on a wall and get to witness one of these, Jewish Passover meals today I wonder what kind of questions do these little kids ask? And is this the little kid, or are we talking 10-year-old little kid? I don't know. I just have so many questions.
And we want both pictures, right? We want to know how a Messianic Jew celebrates a Passover seder.
Yeah.
And then we want to know how a non-Messianic Jew, the one who is still waiting for the Messiah,
Jew
like an Orthodox Jew. We want to know how they are celebrating.
Love to be invited.
I would like to be a part of both of those meals to see how this transitions. When we read all four Gospels side by side, there comes up a question. And if you've ever done this, you know what I'm talking about, friends. There seems to be a difference between the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And remember, Mark is our text, and John. So there's the 3 and 1 about this Passover. And the implication in the synoptic Gospels is that Jesus was crucified on the day after Passover, and that this meal was the day before. But John seems to say that Jesus was crucified on the day of Passover itself as the Passover lamb. And this is definitely the way that I lean. And I wanted to share really some kind of notes that I always draw from when I'm teaching in Israel about this. And I'm going to read this excerpt. Some years before the birth of Jesus, the Passover celebration had been changed, and in the Lord's time, called for a brief ritual meal of lamb, unleavened bread, and bitter herbs to begin on the 14th, followed by a great and leisurely festival meal on the 15th. Remember, that's what we were talking about a few minutes ago. That first feast day of unleavened bread was when they were actually celebrating the Passover seder. And on the 14th, they began to refer to that as the preparation day. And you can see that in the synoptic Gospels, the way they refer to it. And in John's Gospel, they are all telling the same story. But when you put them side by side, you get confused at first, but it's because we don't think about the evening being the beginning of the day.
Yes.
And so this meal that Jesus was taking part with his disciples was this clean out the pantry day. They could have been eating leavened bread at this, and there's no mention of lamb. He does when he sends them forth to make preparations for them to have this meal together. There's no mention of a lamb,
right?
Which would be obvious because Jesus is the Lamb of God. So
Right.
when we read that, we're thinking, well, he is the Lamb of God. Mark and Luke and John all identify the preparation day as the day of the Lord's death. And Matthew 27:62, and we'll put all these in the show notes, says the day after the crucifixion was the day after preparation day. So when you line all of these up, all four Gospels agree that Jesus died on preparation day, the 14th of their month Nisan, which is the Passover. As evening began that day, they ate this ritual meal in the upper room, and then Jesus was arrested, tried, convicted, and put to death, all on Passover. So just like the Lord had commanded in Exodus 12, when they selected the Passover lamb on the 10th, and the lamb was to live with them for the 11th, 12th, and 13th, and kind of being inspected. Think about that as when Jesus came to Jerusalem as the king on the 10th, then he was presenting himself every day in the temple teaching. And so he was literally being examined by the religious leaders.
So good.
It's so good. And so when we are, again, we just have to get our mind around their day started at the evening. And we can see this from the very beginning of the Bible. You can go back to Genesis and look in the creation, because when God created, it says, and there was evening and there was morning. We have to read the scripture through a Jewish lens. I'm going to take us into Mark 14, and we're just going to go through a little bit of this, and then we'll save the rest for our next episode. So again, Twila, there's no lamb mentioned at this meal that Jesus is having with the disciples. Can you read Mark 14, 13 through 15?
Sure. So he sent 2 of his disciples, telling them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. Say to the owner of the house he enters, 'The teacher asks, where is my guest room? Where may I eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there."
Okay, so there's no mention of lamb, but this has always perplexed me. I wonder if it's perplexed you all also. Was this just random? Was this just something that happened? I don't think so. I think that this was a prearranged sign because it's unusual. And what's unusual about it is women carried jars of water. Men carried liquids and water in animal skin containers. So this is our clue. The text is telling us that Jesus had prearranged this sign that they would go into the city and they would encounter a man carrying a jar. And when they saw the man carrying the jar, then they would know
that's our guy.
That's our guy. We need to go with him. And
so you don't mean like Jesus had already like made a reservation with this guy or the household where this guy goes, or is that what you mean?
No, that is what I mean.
Okay. So he's already like made a reservation more or less, like
because all of the travelers are coming
because there's so many people
to Jerusalem. And so there's, you needed to know where you were going to stay.
Right.
And so this was to help. And again, remember, there is a plot underfoot,
right,
where they're looking for Jesus. Mm-hmm. They want to get him out of the way. They want him handled before. They don't want it to go on during the Passover. And also, Jesus knows who his betrayer is.
Right.
He didn't send Judas on this little. Mm-hmm. If we go into the other Gospels, it becomes apparent that it was probably Peter and John that were sent forward to make this arrangement. And another little thing, because we're reading Mark's Gospel, there's a lot of speculation that this probably was Mark's family home, because Mark was a child, young, and we will in a future episode we'll probably pick up about this boy who fled naked from the Garden of Gethsemane when Jesus was arrested, and a lot of people think that was Mark. And if the Passover meal was taking place in his family home, it makes sense that he may have followed them to the Garden of Gethsemane.
Right. That he kind of had a front row seat to a lot of this.
So that's why we say Mark was an eyewitness to a lot of this. Mm-hmm. You want to go on?
Yeah. So starting in verse 16, it says, "The disciples left, went into the city, and found things just as Jesus had told them. So they prepared the Passover. When evening came, Jesus arrived with the 12. While they were reclining at the table eating, he said, 'Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me.' They were saddened, and one by one they said to him, 'Surely you don't mean me.' 'It is one of the 12, he replied, 'one who dips bread in the bowl with me. The Son of Man will go just as it is written about him. But woe to that man who betrays the Son of Man. It would be better for him if he had not been born.'"
In Middle Eastern culture, betraying a friend after eating a meal with him was and is regarded as the worst kind of treachery. And remember, we're in Mark 14, and in our last episode, we talked about that beautiful act of devotion by the woman anointing Jesus, and it was set between this dark plot of the religious leaders and this act of treachery. Mm-hmm. And so here we have Judas eating with Jesus. I mean, he's fulfilling prophecy. He still had a choice. He made the decision, and they're having this meal, And this was his out. If he was ever going to not do this, this was his moment to do it. Because Jesus has made it perfectly clear. I know my betrayer. I know who it is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's hard to like say that and then just to kind of recover from a thought like that. Even though his actions were fulfilling prophecy, isn't it remarkable that Jesus had his betrayer at his table and the others didn't know who he was talking about?
Mm. Well, and just the way that he would go on to treat Judas through that evening, you know, like it's just that he would still, you know, sit at this table with him and break bread. And I mean, it's remarkable.
In our humanity, it is hard for us to reconcile that Jesus loved Judas the way he loved the woman who anointed him, the way he loved all of his disciples. Jesus has a superior love. It is definitely agape, keeping no records of wrong, that you can share this table and look in the eyes of the man who is going to betray you, and you love him even though you know what he's going to do. Wow.
Well, I'm excited for next week where we're going to continue this conversation, because as we've prepared for this, I mean, there is just so much richness and beauty to this story and all that happens, and the symbolism is so rich. And so I can't wait for you all to be able to experience that with us and what you will gain from that, and hopefully the meaning and just the excitement that it will fill you with next time, because you'll understand what these things mean and the symbolism that was there built into the story. So as we always do, Julie, we're going to wrap up with a bright spot. I want to go first because I'm afraid you might steal mine.
Oh, okay. It's possible.
My bright spot was last Saturday night. You and I got to have a little girls' night out. You know, we're so big on food. We got to go to Kentucky Native Cafe, which I've never been. I always hear people talk about it, and it's hard to believe that a foodie like me would have not experienced that. But we had a great meal. It was wonderful. It was beautiful. The weather was great. And then we got to go to Finn's show together, it was fun to be able to do that with you. And so sweet. Like, I mean, I literally cried when he sang because I was so proud, and it was so beautiful. So that was a really fun evening. Get to see my little kid shine and get to be with my friend.
Yeah, it was the best time. You're right. I was going to steal your bright spot because I had such a good time for all the reasons that you mentioned, that we just got to be friends and eat. We weren't working. We weren't doing anything that oftentimes when we're together, we're working now. But we got to just enjoy an evening together. And that was amazing. And I was blown away by these 3 Broadway stars who were there. They were amazing.
Their voices, I mean,
incredible.
Chills. Yeah. So good. I'll let you share this bright spot with me if you'd like.
Thank you. Thank you.
It is really good.
For inviting me into the bright spot with you, because it was so fun. Thank you for taking me. I'm sorry that the person who was supposed to go with you wasn't able to go because they were sick, but it worked out well for me. That's what I said to you, I think, when we were going back to our cars. So, friends, it is always so weird for me when I talk about my upbringing, because it's so different than the average Christian. Whatever your story is, there is such value in it and such beauty to it, because God brings beauty out of all of our stories, and he makes everything bright. And so, friends, just keep following the table flipper and leave the table flipping to Jesus.